Welcome to The Kicker. I'm your host, Megan Greenwell. Today, my guest is Olivia Messer. She was the founding editor-in-chief of the Barbed Wire, which was a proudly progressive but entirely nonpartisan publication based in Texas, covering culture war issues, but also the experience of LGBTQ Texans, Black Texans, Latino Texans. And it's a publication that lasted just under 2 years before it ran out of money and shut down. And Olivia is super candid about all of the things that went wrong, and I think the conversation will be super interesting. Olivia Messer, welcome to The Kicker.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. I've admired your work for a long time. We've been internet acquaintances for a long time. And you recently finished up your first ever editor-in-chief job. And didn't finish it in the way that, sometimes people like to. But I wanted to have you on because I think a lot of people in the media industry spend a lot of time talking about what has worked. And we spend a lot less time talking about what hasn't worked. And it makes sense. It's hard to talk about what hasn't worked. But when your publication, The Barbed Wire, came mostly to an end, you wrote this really lovely letter. And one of the things you said is, I consider myself the world's greatest living expert on what we should have done differently and when we should have done it. But frankly, I'll need some time before I can articulate those thoughts.
And you were like, okay, a month from now.
Literally, Olivia, yes, that's exactly what I did. I was like, I want to do this postmortem, but I can't ask her now. So we'll wait a few weeks and then
Thank
we'll ask.
you so much. I got to go to the pool with my nephew and now I'm ready.
Okay, amazing. So I guess to start, tell me about how the Barbed Wire came up, because you helped create it from scratch, and what it was.
Yeah, so I had done all of this work in the Texas Capitol over a decade on sexual misconduct reporting. And so I had a number of sources kind of on both sides of the aisle, and some folks who'd been working in the Texas political progressive space were interested in what it would be like to make sure that we're, educating the general public in Texas who isn't already reading Texas Tribune or the Houston Chronicle or one of the other incredible major dailies. The idea was, how do we reach young people, news-averse people? But also there was just a real interest in making sure that our, news environment isn't just like robust, but is distributed appropriately so that there aren't just huge groups who are only being, educated by whatever Theo Von clips make it to TikTok. And so we thought a lot about that, but I actually, in my thinking about sort of where we went wrong and in what cases, I think part of what we bit off was more than we could chew, which, I wasn't just thinking, how do we start a newsroom that people will read that makes good journalism? I was thinking, how can we create some kind of new funding model that will change how journalism works forever and make the whole industry more sustainable, which is a crazy lofty goal, and one that I am genuinely relieved to put down, because, I don't know that any EIC is ever really ready to be EIC. And I've been in a lot of newsrooms where, it's like someone who is a columnist or someone who is just a really good journalist, but has never managed before and has never run a budget before and has never made an editorial calendar before, gets put in that position. But it is really hard. And I spent a lot of time trying to recruit someone for the job because I just didn't know if I had the skill set yet. I had mentors who were so sweet about my sort of cross training from local to national and my sort of obsessive fixation on Texas, even when I was in national space. But I think it's also kind of one of those jobs where if you do it right, then the story never really needs to get told of how you got there. And if it goes wrong, there's just a lot of, man, I wish I had known this, and I wish I had learned about this, or I wish I had taken this class, or I wish I had asked for advice from this person. And of course, anytime something fails, that's always going to happen. But I don't know. This is also sort of I've turned from after a year, after 18 months, I was like, man, I would never do this again. This is so hard. I
Mm.
just don't, building, recruiting, coming up with a plan, executing it. Everything costs more money than you think. Everything's harder than you think. Google's not indexing you yet. But now, as some of the dust has settled, I'm very much feel like I could teach a whole class on just like what I learned and what I could have done differently. And so now when people are asking me to consult on other projects and how to create an editorial product, I'm like, well, I actually do have quite a bit of information now,
Yeah.
that I didn't then. So
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the background you do have, because
mhm,
you were at the Daily Beast for a long time doing a mix of breaking news and investigative stuff. And then
mhm,
you moved home to Texas. And
yeah.
you mentioned you started on the Barbed Wire as sort of a consultant. So tell me
Mhm.
about sort of what led you here.
Yeah, so I started my career as an intern for the Texas Observer, um, and really so much about that one internship has defined the whole rest of my
Mm.
career. I had very ambitious ideas for investigative projects, namely an expose on how there's sexism in the Texas Capitol. And at first when I pitched that story, there was a lot of like, yeah, of course there is
Mm.
sexism in the Texas Capitol. Like that's not new. What's new about it? And I had to spend a lot of time figuring out how to tell that story that felt new to me, but wasn't actually new in a way that suddenly felt relevant again. And during that process, our editor in chief, Dave Mann, felt that the story would be very well served with an infusion of first person narrative. And that set my entire career path on a different trajectory, because it really was the beginning of leaning on disclosure as opposed to objectivity, knowing that I am a woman who is going into the Capitol. I was experiencing things with my human woman body, and watching people debate on my right to whatever. Um, and just that one story also meant that my like first ever nationally read piece was in first person as a feature, which sort of thrust me into personal brand as journalist in a way that
Mhm.
I don't think I would have gotten to otherwise. And then I went from there to the Waco Tribune Herald, did the old ladder that used to exist of cover a national mass shooting locally, get poached to a national market. And then the Daily Beast, yeah, I mean, it was exactly right that I was always juggling between trending news and investigations. And I feel really grateful that that newsroom really solidified for me the need for high low. Like I really love an investigation. My largest one there was on a sexual assault ring of children who were getting assaulted at their high school. Um, but it is really hard to live in that space. So I also needed to like do, I don't know, I didn't actually do Bachelor recaps, but I thought about doing them a lot. So that's always the example that comes to my head.
Yeah.
But I did like movie reviews and books and essays. So anyway, that's all to say that when I left the Beast, I took a step back and started working on a novel. And then eventually they were interested in me consulting on this project. And really, it was interesting to be moving back to Texas like almost exactly 10 years after I'd been here the first time, reporting on the Capitol again for the first time in 10 years, all of that. And in a place where the news environment had changed. I mean, to the point of starting the Barbed Wire, part of the idea was that we were starting it at a time when a bunch of nonprofit newsrooms were either collapsing or doing serious layoffs. So we were not interested in doing a purely nonprofit newsroom for that reason. We really wanted to come up with a hybrid model that wouldn't require us to go back to the same potential funders and givers every 6 months. We wanted something that could sustain itself.
Mm.
So we tried to make something where we could accept C3 money, and we were technically a B Corp, meaning we claimed to be operating for the public benefit being journalism, as opposed to just like shareholder value. But the problem with that hybrid, I mean, they're numerous. One, no one else was really doing that, so it was new. And in the end, it did mean that either, I mean, we did end up accepting C3 money, and we had a fiscal sponsor in Linfest at the end, which was great. But for a really long time, every time we met with someone whose job it was to funnel money to nonprofit newsrooms, that the fact that we weren't a traditional C3 always was either a complete barrier to them giving us money that could have saved us, or was such an imposition that it took 6 months for us to really like explain what we were, why we thought it worked, why we thought it made sense, and why we were credible. And I would say everything took longer than we thought it was going to. We took longer to pivot on every idea we had. And we had, and we spent money faster than we meant to, which is, I think, pretty classic, but also they're classics for a reason.
Okay, you said 1 million things there that I want to delve more into. No, I'm excited. But tell me about how you went from being a consultant on this project to being like, yeah, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be the editor-in-chief, having spent your career as a reporter.
Yeah. So, partly I realized through the recruiting process what an impossible job I was hiring for. But I also realized that there were folks who were interested, but who never, had the Parsley login to their news site, or who knew how to write a story, but never actually knew how to get around in the CMS, or were trained on those things, but hadn't done like headline writing seminars. And I realized at some point after, 18 million people had turned us down for the job, that I actually did have a lot of the skills that I felt like were needed. And the places where I didn't, I tried to just get a team of mentors and advisors who could chat with me. And like Elizabeth Spires was, our primary advisor. And I will assume that anyone listening to this podcast already knows who she is. But she is a columnist now at the New York Times. And also, I would say that the most impactful thing that I think she's done because of the generation I'm in is being founding editor of Gawker and completely solidifying the voice we knew as Gawker's voice, which I think also just defined being online for the past 20 years. Anyway, I had a lot of help. But the idea of, my vision for the newsroom was that it would have elements of when the Daily Beast was the best at scoops, when the New York Magazine is the best at essays, when the Daily Beast was like the best at quick turn trending news stuff on its marquee newsletter, The Cheat Sheet, which Tina Brown created. I wanted to pull from all of these different elements, like Slate features and all of those things. One that costs so much money, and I knew how to edit all of those. I didn't know how to teach other people how to do all of them. I didn't know how to recruit and delegate for all of them. And you're doing all of that while you're, as I was saying at the beginning, like you're not getting indexed on Google yet. Apple News doesn't believe you're real yet. Nobody, like, people have signed up for your newsletter, but, and your click-through rates may be really high, but like you're not converting those people to members. And each of those things is like, some of it's business, some of it's management, some of it's editing, some of it's journalism, but actually not very much of it is journalism. Anyway, that's all to say that it's, the joke is that I sort of Dick Cheney'd myself into the position. But also it took me a long time to sort of wrap my mind around, do I really want to do this? And do I think I can? And in the end, I just felt like this thing had to exist. And I had such a clear picture for what it could look like, that then I felt like it was sort of forcing itself to exist through me. And parts of that were really, really gratifying and fulfilling. And parts of it were really scary.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more, if you would, about the editorial vision, because Texas is an interesting place where like it is so big, it is sort of a country. And so theoretically you could have 1 million publications covering it. And there's a more crowded landscape than in some
Yes.
places that are sort of news deserts, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how you thought about setting yourself apart in
Mm-hmm.
a state where, there's still plenty of local newspapers, but like,
Yeah.
the Texas Monthly won a
Mm-hmm.
Pulitzer and 2 National Magazine Awards this year, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
how were you thinking about like this is going to be something really different?
That has been one of the harder aspects, because everyone at every other one of those outlets is someone I'm a fan of.
Yeah.
And also, I've worked in a lot of newsrooms where I've been, righteously indignant about how X or Y or Z editor won't listen to my amazing idea about, any number of things, including, I remember being at the Waco Trib and being frustrated that I got these incredible kernels and quotes from a news story from a court hearing, and the headline is like day 2 of court hearing, and the whole of the article is behind a paywall. And so I sort of approached it like, what if I could take what I learned at the Daily Beast and apply it to a more local, or in this case, like regional situation. Not that other people weren't also doing that, but I do think that there can be a tendency, I think, for the really big, really credible legacy organizations to appear so much about like appearing objective that sometimes it even leans a little deferential. And I wanted our words to be extremely plain language. I wanted it to be completely free of euphemisms. I wanted no equivocating when, the sort of version of journalism where instead of saying this person says it's raining outside and this person says it's not, I'm looking out the window and I'm telling you it's raining.
Mm-hmm.
That really required me to lean into the sort of like parasocial element of trust in journalism as opposed to credibility. And I think we're also in this moment, larger scale, where trust in institutions as a whole has gone down significantly, trust in journalism institutions in particular. And so the only way to sort of beat back against that in a way where people trust and read your reporting is for you to sort of lay all your cards on the table. And so that was a big part of our approach at the beginning. Here are our ethics and standards. Here's how we make decisions. I even wrote a big essay at the beginning that was like, look, I'm a Texan. I'm an 8th generation Texan. We're going to cover oil. My grandfather's in oil. We're going to write about Elon Musk. My brother has a Tesla. We're going to write about, IVF. I was an IVF baby. I was like number 13 that my mom's gyno ever did in Houston. Like all of these things I was really trying to focus us in on reporting from inside a community instead of from outside it, appearing to be objective. And I do think in that respect, we're pretty different than the other outlets here. And I think my favorite description of us from outside was that we appeared to be sort of like Texas Monthly's younger, edgier sibling. I could really vibe with that. And the fact that we were doing, sometimes we were covering similar stories, but their version was, it was like when this big oil tycoon, Oscar Wyatt, died, Mimi Schwartz, who like wrote the original stories on him during the Enron crisis when he was like national news in Houston, she's writing her version of that. And like my version of that is my mom worked in that space underneath that man and has all of these really strange stories about running into him in the elevator. And sort of like, what if that story was sort of like, the Condé Nast elevator Twitter account that used to exist.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Throwback.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was always thinking about how to sort of like, for lack of a better word, Gawker-ify the stories so that they felt like I wanted every single headline of ours to make it absolutely clear why you in particular, this reader should read this story, so not like this lawmaker denies affair with mistress claiming he paid for her abortion, but the guy who wrote the abortion law allegedly paid for his mistress's abortion. Like that way you don't have to already know who the legislator is or what laws they've worked on in order to care about this story. And so that attention plus, I think in the end, what we really did was create another Web 2.0 product. But what I would do differently now is push it into Web 3.0. I'm so sorry to say this, but We didn't pivot to video quickly enough. We did not do enough short form video. We weren't aggressive enough about it. And distributing that stuff, we said from the beginning, was important, but executing that is expensive, and it takes time, and it takes a strategy that it took us, I think, too long to develop.
Mm. So when the site launched in 2024, what was the revenue situation? What was your understanding of what the runway was? And what were your like hopes and expectations for, what the sustainability was going to look like?
We had a 6-month runway at the beginning, for what we basically determined to be our minimum viable product. At the very beginning, I had an idea for, how to fill $14 million. But we, never had $14 million. So I was working on, can I hire 3 people? Maybe can we extend that to 4? Or maybe it's 3 and one person's on contract and then they convert. And we spent a lot of money on credibility. I knew I was going to be having to compete to hire freelancers and get them to give us their scoops. So I needed to pay more and quickly than the Texas Observer, Texas Monthly, ProPublica, anyone else who at all does freelance. We have a great, even Texas Highways Magazine pays super great freelance rates, and they pay on time. And when I was a freelancer, I remembered the outlets that paid me on delivery. Study Hall did that. And I was immediately like, that's what I would like for us to do. The process of doing that, there's prioritizing that kind of thing. And then there's executing it.
Right.
And it did feel like a priority for us. And also it was a lot harder to execute than I thought. Anyway, so that was like the very beginning. Honestly, I think I struggled to even describe the business model, because the idea was sort of like, what if we can diversify our revenue stream enough, convince some investors, get some people to become members, and hopefully that diversity will bring enough in over time. But after knowing about our 6-month runway, I focused so much on the editorial product and not on the business side, which is something that I eventually had to do. Just because I realized we weren't paying invoices and what's going on. But I think I clued into that stuff way too late. And at the beginning, I had thought, well, maybe merch, which we spent a lot of time and money on a bunch of really fun merch.
Very cool merch.
Yeah, thank you. We probably lost money on merch at the end because 1, we gave so much away. And 2, like, it just wasn't, we didn't put the energy into socialing it. And I had really thought, like, I bought Defector's Quit Your Job shirt. I thought that was great. We never had a, like, I'm going to wear this because it's funny and people are complimenting it. Anyway, so merch never, turned around. And part of the idea was, if we can convert readers into newsletter subscribers, then we can convert some percentage of newsletter subscribers into members. But we were not aggressive enough about that. And we didn't employ enough like middle ground, like we didn't do a registration gate until like the last week I worked there. And we had decided much earlier than that after 3 articles, it's okay to grab people's emails for free. But it took a really long time to implement that. And we had a lot of overhead. We were with Newspack. I really liked Newspack, but we were spending a lot of money on these like WordPress products when we probably could have done a Substack for a lot cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know. I think even on the like going to investors and pitching, we launched right before Kamala Harris lost, and that had a huge impact on progressive giving. The tap basically completely turned off. And it was also around the time that a bunch of people had already given money to Courier. And we were distinct from Courier, but they had raised so much money that there were a lot of people who were like, well, I'm already investing in progressive media because I gave them money. Or had just given the Houston Landing a really large gift, and which also closed around the time that we launched. So there was also, and then there was this feeling across the board that like, even though all of this money was pouring into right-wing independent news organizations, we weren't even really using the word independent news yet when we launched. And a lot of people were waiting for us to develop credibility, which is what cost us so much money in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we had it, it was kind of like too late because we were running out of money.
Yeah.
So yeah, but also that, I mean, part of the reason that answer is like very scattershot is because I think our business model was very scattershot.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like to some extent it has to be in the early days of a startup because, like, there's no great way to figure it out other than throwing spaghetti against the
Yes.
wall and seeing what sticks. And
Yeah.
sometimes none of the spaghetti sticks, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is a thing. And
Yeah.
I say that in part because I really wanted to ask you about audience, because the classic startup problem too is like you have to be broad enough that you can appeal to a big
Yeah.
audience. You have to be targeted enough that you build loyalty, because if you're trying to build membership, that's the only way to do it. And then if you have a small staff, which if you're a startup, of course you have a small staff, like
Yeah.
doing both of those things at once feels like Sisyphean.
Yeah.
So how did your thinking about audience and who you wanted reading, subscribing, like
Yeah.
evolve over time?
I mean, so much of that, I feel like we absolutely did the thing, even editorially, where we just threw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall. We were doing like several stories a day, every day. Like our big stat was November 2024, we published like 50 articles. November 2025, we published like 15 and we got like 300x the number of readers.
Oh, wow.
So,
and this was for context, this is how many staff?
4 or 5 full-time.
Yeah.
So we were, I mean, by the time Kara Kelly, our managing editor, she was so good at, okay, here's what's working, here's what's not working, here's what we're doing more of, here's what we're doing less of. We're going to reduce output significantly, improve quality significantly. And that, like, having her come in and sort of reconfigure things in that way was extremely helpful. So at least in terms of the editorial product, I'm so proud of the stories that we published and the audience that we gained. I mean, by the end, we had like 9,000 Instagram followers. We had healthy followings on every social media app. And our first year, we had about 1 million page views. And then once we were accepted to Apple News, like it was November 2025, we had this story on this child with a disability who was taken by ICE and who was severely autistic. And the story about him was like the number 4 story on Apple News that day. And it was like 300,000 clicks. It was something crazy. And so what I think worked out for us pretty well was that we had a real mix. Like we had Leslie, who Rangel, who she had done all of this broadcast television, and she happened to be an incredibly quick learner on writing. Like now she is a very skilled editor, essayist, and she had just never, I mean, she'd written maybe like 2 essays in her career before she joined us. And she is the kind of person who is a genuine joy to edit, because you edit her and then you look at her next draft and she has self-edited using what she learned from your last round. And then we also, and she had a following on Instagram and a coaching business on how to like not lose your mind while reporting on news. That meant that she had a bit of a following. And then Brian Garr is this like longtime journalist, but also stand-up comedian who is like very funny on Twitter. And we had both been at the Waco Trib, but not at the same time. And he is the kind of person that almost everything he reads, like he's got this very clear voice. People are really big fans of his, and they were very complimentary together. Like Leslie would do these like once a month, like heavy investigative stories that would do really well. And Brian would do these like very voicey, quick takes that were super smart and helped you sort of metabolize the news. And those got a very solid sort of like daily readership. So figuring out how to put all the pieces together of the different people on our team to complement each other was part of the audience strategy. And eventually we did turn to making sure that we had a social media person who wanted to do short form video every single day that was wrapping up our stories, or having Leslie do them. You know, Brian was writing the newsletter, then Leslie was making a short form video based on the newsletter, and we were doing those once a week. We wanted to eventually do twice a week. Like in terms of audience, I was really, really happy with how we were growing, with how much people were engaging with our stories. And we did have to implement a very like, if we were publishing a feature that took a lot of money and investigating, then we had weeks out a plan for who are we emailing it to, who am I DMing it to, who are we asking for retweets, whose shows are we asking to be on, what podcasts are we submitting it to. And we were doing all of that ourselves, which is like, 2 full days of work. So everyone has to pause everything else just to push out the story, to make the art, to do the slides, to make the videos, all of that. So even though we had such a small team, we could do a lot of that kind of thing. The problem that we kept coming up against, though, is that, 300,000 people may have clicked on that story, but if that gives you 0 cents, then, you've told an important story, but I don't know how you sustain that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the classic media problem right now.
Yes.
Was there a moment where financially it felt like, okay, like this will work, like we're getting there? Or yeah, how did it feel for you in terms of like, is this going to work? Is this going to be a long-term thing?
I think I thought that at one point. I also think I was wrong to think that. We had a number of leads that I still felt could have really turned out if we had more time. Like, I think we had this thesis for, if we can get a certain number of click-throughs on a story and we have a registration gate and we can convert even 2% of those click-throughs into newsletter subscribers, and then we can convert even 5% of those into members, then if we have enough email acquisition or enough readers clicking on this story, then the math will shake out given enough time. But we were not aggressive enough on each of those points. And, we made these big decisions that, I don't know, maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong. Like I could not square, especially based on our mission, I just could not square using a paywall. I could not square the fact that what's disinformation is free and what's fact-checked is behind paywalls. That just doesn't feel right to me. But I also think that hard line is maybe one of the reasons we didn't last. And so that is, I know that's an age-old problem. I'm still angry that I can't get some of my clips because I don't, I'm like subscribed to the Waco Trib, but like, if I'm subscribed to 50 newspapers, and anyway, but I think the biggest place that could have worked was we had a Queer Texas vertical that we launched last fall. And we partly knew that was one of the underserved communities that is actually huge in Texas. There are a ton of communities in Texas that we just have such a huge population. So there are like 12 million Latino Texans. There are 5 million Black Texans. There are 2 million queer Texans. There are almost more trans Texans than there are trans people in any other state. So there are huge groups of people who are not having their stories told, or their stories are only told as like a victim or a villain, but never the in-between gray area. And daily lives of people, on the border. And, everyone is either the victim of a crime or the perpetrator of a crime, but not just like a person with a full lived experience. So when we started thinking about how to sell a vertical to like get it underwritten by a specific organization or group or company, we found Kind Clinic, which is Texas Health Action. They do like queer public health, and they're a clinic here, and they were interested in underwriting a Queer Texas vertical. And we sold that package for, we like probably took some loss on how expensive it was to actually create all of the content, but we knew that it was going to be a really good test of whether the system could work. Can we create a vertical for a certain amount of money that includes some sponsored content, newsletter, and, say 2 new features every month. And the goal isn't for them to be the most widely read story on the site. The goal is for them to speak to this community that doesn't have these kinds of stories written about them, increase like how robust that coverage is across the state, and, ideally make sure that, like, you know, we're sort of changing the narrative about how many queer people live in Texas and how normal their lives are, and how every community, every rural area, every small town has queer people in it. You may just not know. And that felt really, really like it was working. We didn't get a full year under our belt to prove out with the data in a way that we could have gone back to them and say, hey, can we get 10 times this next time? Because this is, and this is, and this is like all of the gains that it got you. Yeah. And we were also seeing all of these other places interested in what it would be like to fund a Latino vertical or a Black culture vertical or a climate vertical. So we created pitches for like 5 or 6 different verticals that were like fully baked, like logos, people who were interested in getting hired. Like we really wanted to bring in Taylor Crumpton. She's now in Chicago. We were hoping we could maybe get her to move back here and be running our like Black culture vertical. We had all of these people interested in funding those, but you know, the converting of creating a pitch, pitching it to a bunch of orgs, letting them figure their budgets out. You know, we had people like my last week coming back to us and saying, okay, we want to have a meeting about this vertical you created for us 6 months ago. And, you know, we would have still, I mean, those still exist. Someone could still buy them. And frankly, I think there's a lot of really good stuff we didn't get to use, but that was one of the sort of glimmers of hope of, man, if we could have figured out this vertical thing earlier and we could have sold more of them. But I really wanted to believe at the beginning, like we kept talking about how the meat and vegetables approach to journalism doesn't work, that if you have serious stories and silly stories that you're never getting, you know, the high-low mix. And I wanted everything to be more like a gummy vitamin. Like even when you're reading about hard things, it's still funny. And even when you're reading about funny things, there's still like race and historical context and all of these other things. But I had to learn the lesson that some things are monetizable and some things are less monetizable. And you are just not going to be able to sell ads against a story on sexual assault of children the way you are on beauty products. Like you're just not. And I think segmenting that a little bit more maybe would have helped me figure out from the beginning how to make the product that we made sellable, because that's one of the disconnects that I felt like we had.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about how you think of that, because you have spent a lot of your career writing about some of the worst things, right? Murders and sexual assaults. And you've written really movingly about your own experience being sexually harassed and assaulted. Those things are obviously so important to both of us and so important to society to get out there. And also for a startup publication, it's like, there aren't that many people who want to like pay money for that stuff, right? Or maybe they want like the bullet pointed version. I was thinking about this with the Graham Plattner stuff. Like, like there aren't that many people who like they want the headline, right? They don't necessarily want the long form version of it. And we want the long form version of it because we want to make society better. And like, how do you, that is one of those things that just sometimes makes me feel really sad about our industry. How do you think about that now?
Well, I think the big piece is nothing even serious can feel like homework to a reader. Like we did climate stuff. We never used the word climate, not even once. Like it was always, this is a story about children who've been endangered, or this is a story about, you know, whatever it is. A climate story is a public health story, is a true crime story, is Erin Brockovich. Like that was always in my mind. I still feel like I have to package things that way. And I do feel like the Beast really helped me figure out how to do that. And also, I spent a lot of years in my career so immersed in that stuff that I lost sensitivity to what a reader can actually handle. Like I had this 10,000 word story in the Daily Beast about children getting sexually assaulted. And most of my friends couldn't even finish it. Like I remember friends of mine being like, I had to put it down 3 times. I did finish it. It is really good. And now I am on the other side being like, I don't know if I can read that whole thing. It's hard. And so I think it's important as journalists to remain sensitive to what your average reader can actually handle in terms of trauma. I think I went so far in trying to make clear how terrible something was that I cut myself off at the knees at who would be able to even read it. And I think about that a lot, the like high and low. I mean, even now, like I'm still working on sexual misconduct investigations, and I am still thinking about how to write about other things that keep my brain in a better, more healthy place. And I think we don't do enough figuring out how to do the same thing for readers, like how to mix the environment such that they feel like they're in a cool place with people they trust, who are going to tell them hard things and also make little jokes that are gallows humor and also bring in this other thing. You know, I think like not everything can be an investigative story about this terrible man who did terrible things. Some of the things on your website, in your newsletter, whatever you're making, have to be enjoyable to be around, or just at least like, I mean, I know I've talked about Gawker a lot, but in the height of that era, like I was obsessed with Jezebel. I didn't even know Erin Gloria Ryan yet, but I felt like I did. I read everything she wrote. And when something happened, I'd be like, what does Lindy West think about this? I bet she's written something on it. And then I'd go find them and I'd be like, that helped me metabolize what's happening in the world. And so leaning into that, but that also requires a really intense mix of skills. And like not everyone who's good at writing about really dark stuff is also good at infusing it with jokes or in telling it in a way that doesn't feel like homework, and vice versa. Not everyone who writes about Love Island can do so with knowledge of racial and historical context. But I think that is kind of the gold standard in my mind.
Mm-hmm. So the initial runway was 6 months. You made it well past that. When did conversations start getting to the point of like, this may actually be coming to the end?
So I did not realize how close we had come to not making payroll a couple of times. It took me a while to realize not just we were behind on invoices, but we were getting perilously close to not being able to pay our own payroll. And just to the extent that, I mean, we hired a new social media manager in January. I would not have done that if I had understood how precarious things were. But you know, we were also trying to balance, even when I had some degree that maybe things weren't converting as quickly, or maybe we hadn't pivoted to this other thing and investors weren't replying and you know, members weren't whatever. I still, I don't know. I think we could have been a lot more aggressive about spending less money and just producing less content, or having a leaner staff, or, you know, any number of those things. But it really was, you know, we had our first ever like South by, like we had folks on panels and we threw a party, and that was really, that felt like, if this doesn't work, we're done. And we were up for some grants. And around the time, like we had that party, we had some folks agree to big gifts. Those actually didn't convert. So people agreed to give us money, said they would by a certain time, and then didn't. That happened a couple of times, but when it happened at the same time that we found out we didn't get a grant that could have been, I mean, it would have been like maybe $1 million over 2 years, and it would have changed everything. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we heard back that the product was great, but that they just didn't think that we had the finances to survive. Which of course made me be like, so do we not have the finances to survive? And that's when, you know, we very quickly were like, okay, well, if we don't have even, you know, a few months of runway, and, you know, our CEO never took a dime, wow. And he put in his own money at the end. Like we were just trying as hard as we could to extend, partly because when we announced we were closing, like Leslie, our deputy managing editor, was 8 months pregnant. Like the whole team, it felt really serious. And I don't know, it just felt like as soon as we didn't get that grant, and some other things didn't convert, and, we kept getting pushed, we want to see more about that pitch, but we don't have our budget together yet. Like a bunch of things kind of didn't come in all at once. And that felt like, okay, as soon as February was over, I started really worrying. Sorry, no, maybe March, because that was when we had the South by party. But by the end of March, I was really, and then we actually thought we might be able to extend. But one big gift really didn't come in. And then it was like, okay, no. We told our team at the end of March, I think we have through May. And then it was like, maybe we have through June. And then it was like, nope, actually it's just through May.
Uh-huh. And you did a fundraising appeal in April, and the tone of the letter about it was very like, without saying this is close to the end of the road, it kind of came through. Yeah. Were you like, where was your head at that point? Did you think that fundraising appeal could actually turn things around? And did you get good results out of that?
No. Honestly, the best results I ever got on fundraising was drawing pet portraits for people on Blue Sky. That had there was 1 month when I did that where it was like our second best revenue month.
Which
ever.
You did in exchange for new subscribers.
Yeah. So I would, at first it was become a member or subscribe and I'll draw your pet. And then we had enough loyal readers that we had people who were already members who wanted me to draw a second portrait of their pet. So I was like, okay, any donation and I'll draw a picture of your pet. So I'm drawing people's second and third pets. And that is the loyalty in that really touched me. But actually, trying to run that campaign, it did convert some members. And we sort of thought, well, we should have been doing that every month, maybe. But it was not nearly enough to have an impact. And we were still trying to straddle the line between not spooking potential investors and being candid about the fact that we were going to be done. And there was a lot of internal disagreement, not just person to person, but I went back and forth a lot over, should we be, the sky's falling. If you don't give us money tomorrow, we're closing. Or should, because I think there was a real fear that if we did that, then some of our more serious potential investors were going to decide that it wasn't worth it.
Right.
There was always a fear that we would be too candid and that would cut ourselves off before we could contribute. I always lean a little bit more towards full transparency and authenticity. So I always was a little bit curious whether we could have done the full, hey, if you don't give us money tomorrow, we're dead in the water. But even when we announced that I was leaving and Kara was leaving and Leslie was leaving and Brian's going to keep doing the newsletter, there was disagreement on, have we failed, or has this part of it failed? And there's still a website, there's still a newsletter, Kit's still writing stories. Brian's newsletter, I think, is actually the best it's ever been. Wow. I'm still a subscriber. But all of that, the messaging of it was really difficult. There was a lot of disagreement about what, because the stakes felt so high. If we do this wrong, then everyone's livelihoods are at stake. If we do it right, but we couldn't figure out how to do the messaging in a way that everyone felt good about. And except, that was sort of our middle ground was, here's a fundraising drive. This feels like our last chance. We were clear that we won't make it through the summer without a substantial change. And that was the language that we could all agree on. Mm-hmm. But some of this is also just, we didn't have anyone on our business side who'd ever done journalism before. We had some people mentoring and advising, but I think that would have been really helpful. That maybe sounds really obvious, but at the time we were, I try to think of it like some folks came to me and were like, can we pay you to create a newsroom? And like, I got the privilege of making the newsroom I thought should exist in a place I thought needed it. And the fact that it only lasted 2 years actually is better than I thought it was going to be. You know, I thought we would either obviously fail or obviously succeed, and that would be really clear within like 6 months. And of course, that's not at all what happens in any startup. Like, you hobble along for as long as you can, and then eventually, hopefully, that runway is long enough for you to figure some things out and get all your ducks in a row. But a lot of the time, you're just sort of barely not failing, even if you're succeeding editorially. And in the end, it was just like, I think it was actually just, how long can we do this? Because even if we had more money for one more pay cycle or 2 more pay cycles, at some point, the precarity, you know, not least to say that like managing a team of people who don't know if they're going to be employed is very stressful. It felt like the end of the world in my mind in a lot of ways. But ultimately, like, it was kind of just the classic case of like, we were spending more money than we should have been and we weren't making enough money, which does feel like kind of a boring answer.
No, but a true one, and a
yeah.
relatable one.
Yeah.
So it was your first DIC job. It was your first launch of a publication. Would you do either of those two things again?
Yes, though I even a month ago I would have said no. Wow. But I think part of that is like, if I've had folks who are who very generously come to me with potential jobs where I'm, you know, like managing an investigative team, and I think managing right now is I need like a solid 6 months before I can manage other people. Being responsible for a bunch of people's livelihoods and feeling like I failed them was just so difficult. And so just being in charge of myself and my own stuff is a real relief. But as I said earlier, now I have all of these things that I know. And so, you know, I am already consulting on some other editorial products and newsletters, and I have really strong opinions now on like exactly what I'd do differently and when I do it. And some of it is just, you know, how do you set yourself up for success? Like, you can take more time thinking on how to start something and planning for it, because once you go and you're developing a cadence and you're publishing a certain number of stories a week, you can't stop. And it's very hard to do like big picture planning when you're publishing content every day. And I didn't get to do, I kept thinking, okay, I'll figure out how to manage and have budget meetings and do administrative stuff and write. And like, sure. I maybe wrote like 5 stories total. And part of what I felt like we needed to do to succeed was for me to write more, but I could never figure out how to do it. And, you know, what I'm really good at is sexual misconduct investigations. And I didn't get to do any of those. So I got tips over all those years. And I'm also just genuinely so relieved not to have to just sit on them anymore. Like, I can, or hand them to other people and those people don't act on them, which often happens too. Sure. Now I'm like, okay, I can do what I know how to do and what I know I'm good at, which after doing something that was brand new and really maybe unwinnably difficult is just an immense relief.
Yeah. So you're working on your own investigative projects now. You're under contract for a novel. Tell me about how you're thinking about your career now.
Yeah. So I'm really excited to finish my novel. I've had edits due. I mean, I got a round of edits back right before the Barbed Wire launched. And I thought, I'll be able to do these over Christmas break. And of course I didn't. I needed a week off. And so it's been, 2 years of me pushing them down the line. And my novel's about a young woman journalist who goes insane and loses her grip on reality and starts murdering men in the industry. And it's so cathartic to work on. And so I'm really excited about that. But, as anyone who's ever written fiction knows, there's some money in that, not very much. So, I feel really lucky that Kara, our managing editor at the Barbed Wire, she's so talented, and I think we're just like lifelong professional collaborators now. And so she's got book projects that I can help edit pitching and stuff on, and I've got stuff that she can help me with. But we also still have 2 projects, one that we're signing a contract for, and hopefully this week, on another sexual misconduct investigation. We just had not just tips from last year and the year before, but like I've done investigating on misconduct in the Texas legislature for more than a decade. And I have a couple white whales. I've got stories that I wasn't able to land that had to get cut out of other pieces and that now feel like the right time. So I'm genuinely so excited about those. But I do feel like I need to just take a couple months to reset. I would both love another staff job and, struggle under a bureaucracy at this particular moment after being my own boss for so long.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I need to like reset a little before I even figure out kind of what's next. But I don't know. I'm like, as I said, I went from a couple months ago being like, I would never do this again. Don't ask me to being like, well, what if I start 2 different publications and, like at the same time,
Uh-huh.
and they're everything I've dreamed of, and they're super hard and involve a lot of investigative reporting, and they have trendy stuff, and I could do a newsletter. I've got names for everything. I've got logos in my head, and like, who knows, if someone tomorrow at a, wonderful newsroom hired me a full-time job, I don't know that I'd be in a position to turn it down. And also I'm really enjoying the freedom, after putting a lot of pressure on myself to make something work that was really difficult, to just be responsible for my own stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited to see all the things that come next. Olivia, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you for your candor, even in talking about the hardest parts. I think it's important for people to hear. So truly, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Kicker is a production of the Columbia Journalism Review. Our producer is Amanda Dara, and I'm your host, Megan Greenwell. You can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be back with you in 2 weeks.